Today, we're going to talk about desire. And in particular, a lot of this research that I'm going to be talking about with you today is based on the book, The Evolution of Desire by Professor David Buss. As a self-identified romantic, someone who's super into psychology, I find this stuff fascinating. And I think that you might too. There are some really cool takeaways in here that I want to share with you. And after reading the book and listening to a bunch of interviews, I kind of boiled down all of the main ideas into a couple key core nuggets that I'm excited to share with you. But what I'm going to do here is break down this video into a couple key sections. This is the container that we're going to build everything into. So we're going to have this container of general mate selection and strategy. We're going to go what women want versus what men want in the long term. We're going to go what women want versus what men want in the short term. And then we're going to go into what are some ways that you can appear more attractive for the opposite sex. And then so kind of key takeaways for you that you can implement into your own life if you want to be perceived as more attractive. And then we're going to go the similarities and the differences between the sexes. Before we jump into the cool, sexy stuff around desire, I want to put this in a container. I want to hedge this with the idea that these are traits, characteristics, strategies that have developed over hundreds of thousands of years. I'm going to be painting with some very broad strokes here, and so I just want to be upfront about that. But all of the different things that he talks about in the book are backed up by studies, different research that he's looked into, but I just wanted to hedge it with that. Up front, I know this seems a little crazy, but there are some interesting ideas about mate selection and desire that are uncomfortable to confront, but are based in reality and thousands of years of evolution. Even though it's hard to admit, romance, sex, love, and desire are inherently strategic. The whole point of this is to pass our genes on as successfully as possible to continue the human race. If you are curious about only certain sections of this video, I will have everything kind of time-stamped below, so check that out. That way you can kind of bop around, skip around. If you just want to know about short-term dating versus long-term differences, all that stuff, check it out below. Let's jump into it. So the first thing we're going to jump into is what women want in the long term, and what is women's long-term mating dating strategy. Women want something different than men inherently because women's reproductive resources are relatively precious. Investing in sex is more of a lift for women because you are the ones that actually have to bear the child. So women's long-term mating strategy always boils down to one thing, and that's resources. Physical traits and other things, personality traits, these are important, but the reason that those things are important, which we'll dive into, is how they again relate to resources. Women don't just want a super hot guy. It's because of the way that they can control resources better. A couple big ideas around women's long-term mating strategy. It tends to appear that women tend to date a little bit older because all of these things, esteem, status, power, with those things, a man can acquire more. Another thing that women are good at doing is evaluating a man's potential for future resources. Someone who's ambitious, industrious, their potential for future resources was another thing that was often evaluated for a long-term dating strategy. Here's some interesting data. Check this out. Women value financial prospects twice as high as men do, and male occupational status seems to be the best predictor of the attractiveness of the woman he marries. As men, it's often correlated that the more resources that you're able to accumulate, or a power and esteem, again, these things that kind of that are indicative of resources, often increase your chance in a better mate selection for a man. These ideas about resources aren't limited to capitalist countries. The study that I'm referencing had 10,047 people in 37 cultures and 6 continents. Across the board, the long-term strategy for women was about men with resources. The last two pieces that I want to dive into here for women's strategy is traits, both personality and physical. The ideal man is going to be tall, often above 6 foot, athletic, and have a V-shaped torso as well as symmetrical facial features. And the reason, again, all that sort of stuff is because it's indicative of the man's ability to accumulate resources. When it comes to personality traits, things like being ambitious, driven, empathetic, kindness. Again, I'm not saying these are what all women like, but this is in general, these are signs that the male is going to be a healthy partner. So to wrap up women's long-term dating strategy here, when it comes to resources, a man who can provide, women solve the problem of protection from aggressive men, at least in part by preferring a mate who has the size, strength, and physical prowess to protect them. So we don't just think that hot guys are just hot for no reason. There's a reason that it's kind of baked into the DNA that women like those traits in a man. in general. So that brings us to men. What is men's long-term dating strategy for women? What a man really wants is fertility, health, and to know that the offspring is his. Okay, if a man just wants to procreate, why aren't we more polygamous as an animal? If a man is willing to commit to a woman, he has a higher chance of her willingness to commit to him. Here's the quote: "Since it's more costly for women to reproduce, devoting to one partner for a time was a strategy for attracting a more desirable mate, increased with the men's willingness to commit." So again, for men, we get real weird when we feel like there's some other potential man in our woman's business, and there's a reason for that. What's interesting, when it comes to bodies for men, what men want in a woman, long-term dating, it came down to the waist-hip ratio, because waist-hip ratio is indicative of a woman's reproductive status. So it was really interesting to look at the data. Women, on average, thought men wanted a woman that was much slimmer than they actually did. But needless to say, we tend to like thicker women on average than women think we do. So that's kind of interesting. The last thing I want to touch on for long-term dating strategies for men is sexual loyalty. There's a reason why men, we tend to get more jealous, is because we want proof that the child is our child. Short-term dating, interesting thing with short-term dating, both men and women are more lax in terms of what they're looking for. Women are still very selective, and they will often shoot for like a higher status type of a guy. For men, our short-term strategy is very different than our long-term strategy. Men are much less discerning. We'll just leave it at that. You know what I'm talking about. Our physical traits, it's much more important to have important physical traits. They had a study that was really interesting where it was in France, in the US, and a random stranger would approach someone of the opposite sex and just say, "Hey, you want a bone?" And in France, I think it was like 83% of men just said, "Yeah," and like went for it, compared to 3% of women, just a stranger on the street. Compared to in the States, in Florida, 100% of the women said nah, and I think it was like 70% of the men were into it. But obviously men were much less discerning when it comes to just sexual behavior rather than long-term dating strategy. So when it comes to attracting women, so this is going to be for men, it comes down to traits and appearance. Let's start with appearance. What signals that you have resources? It's often going to be nicer clothes, maybe jewelry. This is why people are into chains and watches and gold teeth and all the stuff you see in rapper videos. Like, we want to show that we have resources. There's one study that looked at both how men and women judged the opposite sex in regards to dating for short-term, just sex, and long-term dating. Check this out. Women judged men in tight-fitting and revealing clothes to be less attractive than fully clothed men in all conditions of dating, marriage, and sex. They ran this experiment where they had the same men and they were photographed in two different outfits. One was like with a Burger King hat and a polo, and the other was like a nice white shirt with a Rolex watch and nice jeans, designer shoes. And the guys with the Burger King hat were not suitable for dating, sex, or long-term relationship. Same guys, but in nicer clothes, were eligible. Same women for all three, for dating, sex, and relationship. So that's kind of the physical appearance piece. If you want to appear more attractive, desirable, dress better, demonstrate resources. When it comes to traits, there are a couple big things too. High confidence was really important. If you demonstrated you were confident in yourself, the way you talked to a woman, that was a turn on. Humor, also a huge turn on, because I think this signified intelligence and also, of course, ambition. Another thing that men can do to attract women mates, they can display kindness and generosity. They can demonstrate resources, so that's often in like jewelry, cars, etc., or they can also show commitment. Also, something to note, men often overestimate our rank. Whether we like to admit it or not, we all have a mate value. So if like a girl smiles at us, we interpret that as something sexual and overrate our attractiveness. So what can women do to attract a male partner? Men found women in tight-fitting and revealing clothing more attractive than fully clothed women as dating partners and sex partners, but not as marriage partners. When it comes to attracting a male for short-term dating, there are some very clear strategies. Wearing more revealing clothing, brushing up against him, walking with a hip swivel, all of these things constitute attractive traits for men. Here's a little hack though for you ladies. I thought this was pretty fascinating. Initiating visual contact also proves to be a highly effective tactic for women who seek to attract a sex partner. Looking intensely into a man's eyes and allowing him to see her staring are judged to be among the top 15% of effective tactics women can use to attract short-term sex partners. Men like an aggressive approach, a woman who's going to come up, be maybe a little in your face, touch your arm, touch your hair, whatever, cleavage is out. Women are not about that. The more upfront men are with those exact same strategies, the more of a turnoff it was. So keep that in mind. When attracting a partner, men were a little slow sometimes. That's not a surprise. So women, you kind of got to be a little overt about it. For women, you can be much more subtle on the approach, more respectful, more smooth, be confident, come in with some jokes, be humorous, be more charming, be less upfront with the sexual stuff. I now want to jump into similarities and differences between attracting a short-term and a long-term potential partner. Men on average report a greater desire for more variety in their sexual partners. Similarly, large gender differences emerge from studies of masturbation rates and pornography consumption. The industries of porn and prostitution are mainly dominated by men, and here's some really interesting data on that. One study found that 69% of American men had been to a prostitute, and for 15% of them, prostitution was a regular sexual outlet. The corresponding numbers for women were so low they weren't even reported. How crazy is that? Another thing, though, came in terms of affairs. This is another place where men are more sexually deviant. Another study found that 50% of men, but only 26% of women had extramarital affairs. Some studies show that the gap may actually be narrowing. One study of 8,000 married men and women found that 40% of the men and 36% of the women reported at least one affair. When it comes to variety, we aren't necessarily all that different. So men, we do like variety, but check this stat out. The same study I was talking about before found that women were almost twice as likely to achieve orgasm with their affair partners as with their husbands. Other research shows that after years of marriage, husbands lose more sexual interest in their wives than wives do in their husbands. So that's kind of a bummer. But again, it doesn't mean that all marriages are doomed, although I do think it's like 50% of marriages end in divorce or something like that. It can be done. We can make it happen. Is it tough? Absolutely, but it is doable. Where are we the same? This is the note I wanted to end on. Both sexes place a tremendous value on intelligence and dependability in a lifetime mate. Both seek long-term mates who are cooperative, trustworthy, and loyal. And both desire mates who will not inflict crushing costs on them. So long story short, y'all, there is hope. Be a good person, have a good sense of humor, be intelligent, try to increase your mate value. Don't try to degrade the other sex, especially for men. I think a lot of times it feels like it's like this men versus women thing. Like everybody's a gold digger out to get you. Not true. Just through evolution. Dude, it's good. Like build some resources. Like that's a good thing. It's not rocket science. A lot of this makes a lot of sense. It doesn't mean everybody feels this way. This just happens to be the way that we've evolved. Whether you like it or hate it, what would you rate it? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, I appreciate y'all. Good luck in your mate selection, and I'll check you on the next one. Peace.